Devil May Cry is a franchise that I heard lots of great things about, but was one of the series that I missed out on back when it first released on the PlayStation 2. Compared to today's era of gaming where we don't get a lot of great hack and slash titles, I thought it'd be a good idea to start from the beginning and review every DMC game in the series. So this video houses all of my reviews for every DMC game in the franchise, saving the DMC 2013 reboot for last since that was the final game I reviewed. Let me know what your favorite Devil May Cry game is in the comment section below, and thanks for watching. Devil May Cry, a franchise that I've never had the opportunity to play, even though I've known of its existence for years. This is one of those few series I first dropped back in the PS2 era that I missed out on, so I was surprised when I found out there was 5 games I had to play through. Regardless, I decided to dive into the first Devil May Cry. Not even 15 minutes into the game, there was one thing that I noticed immediately: the difficulty. I wish that someone would have told me this game was hard, because I went into this thinking this was just your normal hack and slash. I had no idea how much I was going to have to try, even on normal. Now, I'm in no means the best gamer in the world, and I play most of my games on normal or hard mode, and I'm able to complete them without too much trouble. But every now and again, I run into a game that does give me trouble, and DMC 1 was just that. Before I go into the actual mechanics of the game, I wanted to explain where I think the game's difficulty comes from. The game is broken up into missions, and in order to progress, you have to complete various tasks until you reach the mission complete screen. These varied from killing demons to solving puzzles, but what makes this game hard is the enemies themselves. Every time you reach an area, there's enemies in the room that can be a pain to fight. Once you finally kill them, if you exit and then re-enter the room, the enemies reappear. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but once you start to backtrack and you're low on health, fighting the same enemies you already defeated can make everything more difficult. And not the good difficult either, the one that requires skill. The unnecessary difficult that's just annoying. But wait, that isn't the real part where I struggled. By far the hardest part of the game was the boss fights. These boss fights were absolutely terrible. Most of them are against enemies that took up most of the screen, so it's hard to find their weak spot to attack. Couple that with a terrible camera, and you are in for a long fight. What's crazy is that the bosses themselves aren't hard to beat, but it's the limitations of the game that makes it so hard. For example, in the beginning there's a giant spider that you have to fight. This fight is complete bullshit, as the spider does range attacks that you have to dodge, but as you dodge, the camera itself changes direction, making it hard to keep moving in the path that you first intended to go in. To make matters worse, the entire body of the spider can't be damaged except for its head, which is in the front. So in other words, you have to stay in front of the spider and try to attack it, while it performs a handful of different moves and jumps all over the place, all inside a very small area. You can imagine how annoying this fight was. This was just one example, but the design of the boss fights made everything so much harder than it needed to be. If you've been playing games long enough, then you know that game that has those fights that are hard just because of the way they're designed. Like if they were more balanced or how you defeated them was more clear and forgiving, then you might get your ass kicked, but it would still be fair. But not in this game. There's one enemy called Nightmare that you have to fight multiple times, but its final fight is easily the worst in the game.
Trish, stay back!
Again, they place you in a cramped room with it performing multiple attacks, but what makes this so hard is that the weak point is hard to reach. I won't go into any more detail in case you plan on playing this, but be prepared to die a lot in this game, especially during the boss fights. Paired right with the boss fights is the camera. This camera is one of the worst cameras I've ever played in a video game ever, and I've played a lot of games. At first it doesn't seem that bad, as you see Dante and all the demons in front of you with ease. Where it gets annoying is when you start moving around, as the camera switches angles as you move to different parts of the room. So if you're in a square room with 4 walls and decide to go across to the other side so you don't get hit, more than likely the camera is going to change angles, changing your field of vision. Again, this doesn't seem like a big deal when fighting normal enemies, but when you're in those fights with large bosses and tight spaces, the camera changing angles is absolutely detrimental. Since it's always moving, you have to anticipate where it's going to go so you can continue down the path you started before the angle change. On top of that, the changing angles may mess up your perspective on the enemy itself. Because you're viewing the demon from another side, you may not be able to reach its vital area so you can inflict damage. This is very important, as some enemies have weak points on distinct parts of its body. So imagine you finally reach the area on an enemy, get ready to attack, but end up missing because of the camera. That is exactly what I experienced. It wasn't until I kept myself in the same area that I was able to attack where I wanted to. If the camera was improved, it would have helped make the game smoother and less difficult. Now in regards to the actual mechanics of the game, they're really easy to get the hang of. As I mentioned earlier, it's a hack and slash game, so you're constantly fighting things, which in this game are demons. As you pull off combos without getting hit, there's an on-screen gauge that throws out names based on how many combos you pulled off. They could read something like dull, cool, absolute, and others. I thought this was a neat way to highlight the combos you were pulling off instead of having your typical combo hit meter. The movement itself is really good, as Dante moves fast and isn't hard to control in the slightest. Since the game was made in the PS2 era, the controls are a little outdated, but with a little practice, it's easy to get used to. What took me the longest to master was the jumping, as Dante couldn't double jump but could jump off of obstacles and walls. There's a slight delay when jumping as well, which had me miss rocks and floating objects many times. Combine that with the camera and the platforming can be a bit of a chore. Thankfully, there isn't too much platforming, so I wasn't spending too long in the areas that required you to jump. Fighting the demons gets addicting really fast. There's a multitude of demons that appear throughout the levels, all with different attack patterns. To kill them, you have the ability to use two things, a main weapon and some sort of gun. Personally, I used the shotgun combined with Alistor, which was a different form for your devil arm. To put it simply, this was an electric sword, but where things get interesting is in regards to the devil trigger. Since Dante is part demon, he has the ability to use these demonic powers which correlate to his main weapon of choice. Just as I mentioned before, the Alistor demon, which gave me my sword electric abilities, these abilities could be unlocked in the power-up menu, where you could spend red orbs, which served as currency, to use them in combat. As you progress, you unlock more weapons to use and more devil abilities to use them with. The ability to use the devil powers is called the devil trigger, and man was this useful. It not only makes you stronger, but makes you regain health as you inflict damage to enemies. I didn't use this in normal combat until I got stuck or was on the verge of dying, almost as a last resort type of move. Where it gets good is once you understand which enemies respond well against which weapons, so you know which devil powers will work the best in each scenario. After using the devil trigger, it would gradually refill as you landed more hits on the enemy as well. Combined with the guns, the combat is so much fun. Fighting waves of demons and then using your devil powers to shred them entices you to grind and earn red orbs just because the combat is good. Speaking of grinding, I would advise you to do that early and often, as you're going to need a good amount of red orbs to help you get through the game. If it wasn't for the red orbs I collected along the way, I don't think I would have been able to beat this game honestly. As you move through each level, there's different colored orbs in each room. Like I said before, the red ones are pretty much money, but there's other colors that are vital to helping you get through the game. There's the blue orbs, which when you find 4, your max health is increased. Yellow stars, which grant you invincibility for a brief time and allows you to use your devil trigger during that time as well, while other orbs fill your devil gauge and give you more devil trigger uses, all which come in clutch depending on the fight. This may seem like cheating, but it's really not. As a matter of fact, I would argue that collecting these power-ups are absolutely necessary to finish the game. Unless you're an absolute god at DMC, you're going to need to grab at least some of these red orbs to upgrade something. Trying to complete this game without any upgrades or items is an extremely daunting task, one that I was not up for. Regardless, you could hoard these items from level to level, so if you have 5 health orbs, you can keep them and use them in the next level. You may be wondering, how exactly do you buy this stuff? Well, there's statues of light within each mission that serve as mini stores where you can access everything that I mentioned before. If I had to narrow it down to one thing that I would prioritize buying, it would be the yellow orbs that allow you to restart the part inside of the mission that you were actually on. Since many of the fights have multiple phases, it's crucial to stock up on the yellow orbs because you want as many chances as possible to fight the enemy. If you don't have at least a couple of these, you're going to wish you did, because once you run out of orbs, you have to restart the mission all the way from the start. And depending on the mission, that could be multiple rooms that you would have to clear all over again. So be sure to prioritize yellow orbs and the green health orbs at all times. The last thing I wanted to mention was the map. Accessing the map is easy, as you can enter the menu where you'll see the area you're in along with all the floors. It's not hard to find out where you need to go, as there's doors and colors highlighted on the map that will guide you in the right direction. What can be a bit tricky is knowing exactly what to do next. Similar to the Resident Evil games, there's puzzles that you need to solve and things that you have to collect. The game does give you hints in regards to solving the puzzle, but it's really up to you to figure out what to do. Thankfully, most of the time you just need to collect something and then place it somewhere else. which isn't hard. But because the items themselves aren't marked on the map, even if you've already seen it before, you have to remember where everything is so you're not constantly getting lost. To offset this, I would advise you to fully explore each area so that you know where everything is, and then you can piece together what you need to do or collect to progress further. Now, I'm not telling you how to play the game, and you can do what you want, but if you ignore the prompts or clues, be prepared to do a lot of backtracking during each mission. The gameplay in DMC is easily the highlight of the game, and if it wasn't for the crappy camera and poorly designed boss fights, it might have been perfect. But for a game that released over 20 years ago, it's still incredible. The story for DMC is simple, yet interesting at the same time. The main character is Dante, who's a half-human, half-demon son of famous demon killer Sparta. Trish, a mysterious woman who appears inside Dante's shop, asks for help with killing a demon lord called Mundus. As the story goes on, you gain more backstory into who Mundus is and his involvement in Dante's past, all while introducing you to a couple of characters that you run into multiple times. Right from the start, the tone is serious, yet playful. I know that sounds contradictory, but it's really true. You can sense the danger of the situation as each fight is a life and death scenario for Dante, but the dialogue makes everything feel so lighthearted at the same time. It helps make everything not feel so tense, which is a good thing after raging on one fight for so long. There isn't much to Dante at first, but as you understand his past and start using him, he grew on me fast. It's like he's not afraid of anything, but also has a human touch that makes him relatable. Trish, on the other hand, I didn't trust her right from the start. I knew there was something off about her right from the opening cutscene, although her character had a lot of development and is completely changed by the end. I went from not caring about her at all to wanting her by my side from here on out. If there was one thing that could have been improved, that would be the villains outside of Mundus. Those villains' backstories and motivations aren't explored that much, and you don't find a whole lot of information about them until you finally kill them. Honestly, if you look in the menu, you can find a sort of compendium of all the enemies you fought, and the little synopsis has more info than what's explained in the game. Not a big deal, but something I did remember by the end of the story. The story for this game looks cheap and rushed on the surface, but once you get deep enough, you'll see that it has tons of emotion. It also does a good job at making you care about a main character that you've just been introduced to only hours prior. Overall, Devil May Cry 1 is an absolute joy to play. Yeah, it's frustrating and I definitely raged a bit on some of the missions, but it's still worth trying out. At its core, the main issues stem from the awful camera system and poorly designed boss fights. So if you can get used to those, you'll be able to beat this game. Regardless, the combat alone makes it addicting and hard to put down. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8. If this game got a full-on remake, then it could be even better. Releasing way back in the early 2000s, I can understand why this game got such high scores, and I definitely think it's deserving of them. Unfortunately, I can't look past the camera in those boss fights. At the time, all of that was probably seen as a skill issue, but now, all these years later, it has more to do with design than skill. Either way, I loved my time with the game and I can't wait to play Devil May Cry 2. Recently, I started my Devil May Cry journey and just got done finishing the first game, which was a hard but enjoyable experience. But ever since I completed that, all I've heard was, "Oh man, you better get ready, DMC 2 sucks." Or "Man, you really gonna play DMC 2? But I'm not the type of guy to skip a game, so I had to try it. Going into it, my expectations were low, considering how much slander I've heard about the game, but even still, I didn't know what to expect. Understanding the reputation this game has, I went into this thinking that the gameplay was going to be drastically different, but instead, it was more of the same. However, there is one key aspect that's different in this game compared to DMC 1, and that's the ability to play as Lucia. Since this game has 2 playable characters that you need to use to finish the game, let's talk about each character and their own gameplay separately, since there's subtle differences between the two. Starting off with the obvious, you can play as Dante. His movement is about the same as the first, with him doing this medium-paced jog as you run from place to place, but it's still a head scratcher as to why there isn't a direct sprint button, because that would make everything even faster, but it's really no big deal. The jumping is about the same as well, with him being able to double jump and jump off of obstacles onto other platforms. His actual combat is slower than it was before, but he's still able to perform a set of combos if you mash the attack button. One thing I didn't utilize for not only Dante but Lucia was the aerial attacks, as there wasn't a lot of situations where I had to juggle enemies mid-air to inflict damage. If you're familiar with DMC, then you already know about the array of weapons Dante has, and this game is no different. I'd have to say between the pistols, machine guns, shotguns, and rocket launcher, I still enjoy the shotguns the most. To me, it seems like they had the best balance of firepower and reload speed, making them a must for most encounters. A close second would be the rocket launcher, as the damage output was high on those as well. Now regarding his swords, I thought they didn't make a huge difference in the gameplay. The changes between each sword may help in the combat, but it really depends on the enemies you're facing as to which sword you prefer the most. If there was one I leaned on, it would be the one that's a bit slower but does more damage. I forget the name, but it just does a couple of slashes that lower a significant amount of HP depending on the enemy. As far as his devil abilities, they function just as they did before, with you having different elements that you could use which would enhance your attacks. What I thought this game did a good job of was forcing you to use all the abilities, because the same one doesn't work on every single enemy. Now I could be wrong, but in the first game when you activated the devil trigger, you would regain health only when damage was dealt. But in this game, you have the option to equip an ability that emphasizes health regeneration while in devil form, which I thought was a really good addition. If this was in the first game and I forgot, let me know in the comments. Let's switch gears to Lucia. Lucia's gameplay is similar to Dante's, but there's enough of a difference for one to have a preference between the two. As a sword, she has what looks like a pair of cutlasses called cutlassier, which are decent weapons, but not memorable in the slightest. Performing her physical attacks are slower than you would like, but still serve a purpose, but overall I think she's best used from afar. In my opinion, attacking from a distance with Lucia is definitely the best approach to almost every combat situation, regardless of the enemy type. She has access to a handful of throwable weapons, all useful depending on the situation, but by far the most useful are throwing knives. Lucia throws these fast, and it doesn't take long at all for the animation to sort of recharge and allow her to throw them again. Once you collect enough red orbs, you can upgrade the damage on these, making them even more effective. If you only played the first game, you may be thinking, well, that's cool, but what's the big deal? The reason why these knives are so important is because the boss fights are no longer in tight spaces. In the first game, most of these fights were in small corridors where it was beneficial to use physical attacks, whereas these encounters are in bigger, more open spaces, giving you the ability to jump around and attack from different angles with ease. You can probably see where I'm going with this. If you keep your distance, you can just spam the throwing knives until the enemy's health dwindles all the way down to zero. Depending on the enemy, this can be a bit time consuming, but most of the time, this strategy works on almost every fight for Lucia, at least on normal. Just like Dante, she has the ability to use devil powers which help out in combat. I would say there isn't anything crazy in regards to the differences between her powers and his, but it's worth noting that how you use her powers combined with the weapons is going to be different than how you would with Dante. For some reason, I used the regenerative ability more with Lucia than I did Dante. Probably because her physical attacks don't deal as much damage, even when upgraded, but that's just me. Both Dante and Lucia's gameplay is fun and addicting, as facing waves upon waves of demons never really gets old. Even though the speed isn't as fast as I would like, the movement is still good, making it easy to perform various combos and attacks. But one thing that hindered both of their gameplay is an issue that was present from the first game: the camera. If you played the first, then you know that the camera was absolutely terrible. It was a pain to move from place to place, as it would change angles at the most inconvenient times and make the combat way harder than it should have been. Unfortunately, it's not much better in the sequel. Right from the beginning, you can tell the camera is about the same, as you see Dante from a third-person perspective, but as soon as he starts to get out of frame or is too far out in the distance, the camera would shift, which on the surface it makes sense. But where the camera really starts to get annoying is during the combat. Most of the time you're on the ground when fighting enemies, but this game features a lot of demons that can fly. However, when those same enemies approach you, they never fly low enough for you to see. At first, it may seem like it's not that serious, but when you have a handful of demon birds that are at the top of the screen, and you can't view where they are so you can hit them, it gets frustrating pretty fast. What makes it even worse is that you can't move the analog stick up to manually move the camera. The camera stays at the same height no matter what. In order to kill these aerial enemies, your best bet was using range attacks in the air or from the ground to inflict damage. This inability to change the camera height not only affects the combat, but the platforming as well. It still changes angles, which is to be expected, but when you need to jump up, trying to judge where you're falling can be tricky at times. If you could move the camera up above your character to see where you would line up when you jump, the platforming sections will go a lot smoother. Some of these critiques regarding the camera may seem minute to the casual player or be seen as a skill issue, but once you get your hands on the game, you'll see how much it hinders the gameplay. Another critique that I gotta bring up is the targeting system. During combat, a purple reticle will appear over top of the enemy that you're attacking, serving as some sort of lock-on. However, when faced with multiple enemies, there isn't a way to manually switch the lock-on. Instead, it goes away and then returns as you get closer to each demon. Again, it's not game breaking, but what happens is that you'll end up striking enemies that you don't want to, simply because the reticle moves on its own. There isn't a setting to change it either, forcing you to adapt and get used to the automatic targeting. Now I understand that this game is dated, as it released during the PS2 generation, but manual or automatic lock was a thing back then for sure. I can't imagine why that wasn't included in this game. Regardless, once you learn how the reticle moves, it gets easier to deal with. The last thing I wanted to mention is that the boss fights are not nearly as annoying in this game as they were in the first. As I mentioned earlier, they don't take place in super small corridors and the difficulty has been turned down a couple notches. What I thought was cool was the color health bars, as the enemies had different color HP bars as you progressed further in the game. As soon as I saw those, it reminded me of the bosses from Kingdom Hearts 1, which used the same color coding system for the boss fights. The actual fights themselves aren't hard at all, and as long as you stock up on items, you should be able to breeze through almost every fight. To my surprise, they brought back the one enemy I thought I would never see again, the giant spider.
Finally! I was getting tired of playing your childish games.
If you don't know, this spider is one of the first bosses you face in the first and gave me all sorts of trouble, so to see it again made my skin crawl. Fortunately, the devs kept its attack patterns the same, and coupled with the added space, the fight was a cakewalk. Hopefully that is the last time I see that ugly spider as I move throughout the rest of the series. To put it simply, this game is just as fun as the first because it's essentially the same. Outside of playing with two characters, everything feels familiar, like I picked up right from before. If the camera issue was fixed and the movement was faster, then the whole gameplay loop would have flowed better. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, Trish is a playable character if you beat the game in hard mode, but I finished my normal run with both characters and dipped. I hear that there's some differences with her gameplay, and I wish they would have let her be playable from the jump, but I'll do another run one day to get the opportunity to try her out. If there was one area where the game really lacked, it was the story. It takes place on Vie de Marley Island, where Dante has to help stop a businessman from raising a demon and obtaining supreme power. If you played the first, you may be a little confused because that's not where we left off at the end. On top of that, I found myself looking around like, where's Trish? We went through so much to save her in the first game that I thought for sure she would be in the second, but she's nowhere to be seen. Once again, the story is told slowly through missions with cutscenes playing at the start and end of each mission as you complete them. The cutscenes themselves look better visually, but I'd be lying if I said I really cared about this story much at all. Even at the start, the whole vibe felt off, like it was lacking that DMC flair. Yes, it had demons, but it was just missing something. The best way to describe this plot is like a side story, as if Dante got called away to complete a job before returning back to the shop. It's hard to get invested in Lucia and the other characters when they did such a good job at building up Dante, Mundus, and Trish in the first game, making my interest in this story dwindle as I got deeper in. Oh yeah, and the villain is completely forgettable. I can't even remember his name. Axel? Orin? Arius, that's his name. Man, this guy was a pushover, and I didn't give a flying about this character in the slightest. In my opinion, this guy was missing the most important quality a villain needs to have, and that's the threat of danger. Not for a single second did I think this guy really posed a threat. He just seemed like some kook who got his hands on some demon powers and we had to put this man down. In the end, the story is the aspect of the game I dislike the most, and if that's where the majority of the slander comes from, then I completely understand. A good thing is that the cutscenes are completely skippable, so if you want to replay the game, you don't have to go through everything all over again. Real quick, I wanted to discuss the atmosphere of the game. The entire game takes place on a deserted island, and it definitely felt deserted. The whole time we didn't see any mind-bending effects or rituals or things that were present in the first. Sure, there's traps and statues in different rooms, but the whole trippiness from before was gone. One thing I liked about the first was how everything felt magical yet creepy at the same time. Even grabbing orbs and gaining demon powers didn't have the same pop or flair that it did before. I know I only played the first, but when I think of DMC, I think of over the top, grand, and flashy, and this game was the complete opposite of that. I don't know if that's the entire point, was for the game to be dreary and gloomy, but it didn't hit at all. I like the risk that they took with the location because fighting on a demon infested island is pretty cool, but everything inside wasn't executed the best. Hopefully in the next game we get back to how DMC normally is. Overall, I think Devil May Cry 2 was vastly overhated and not nearly as bad as I've heard and seen on the internet. Yes, there's issues with the game that hold it back from being as good as it could have been, but that's just it. The issues are fixable, at least in the gameplay department. The story? Yeah, that entire thing should have been scrapped and rewritten right from the start. But as a complete package, the game isn't bad, but it doesn't have that DMC feel and look that was present in the first. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7.5. I enjoyed my time with the game, but most of what I liked came from the gameplay and not the story. The atmosphere was different from the first, and the story gives many players a good reason to not ever return to this game. However, if you're someone like myself who enjoys the gameplay of this, then it's definitely worth running through this game a couple more times, especially to play as Trish. If this was the worst game in the entire franchise, then I can't wait to play the rest of the DMC games because I'm sure those are going to be miles ahead of what this game was. I'm excited to play DMC 3 and see how much better that game is compared to this title. Going into Devil May Cry 3, all I wanted was the series to go back to formula, back to its roots. After playing DMC 2, which I didn't think was that bad, I was hoping that this third entry in the series would be more in line with the first game. If you played 2, then you know exactly what I'm talking about with all its flaws, and I'm sure you have way more than I mentioned in my own review. Regardless, I booted up this game not knowing what to expect, but by the time I reached the end screen, I was exhausted, but satisfied. At its core, the gameplay for DMC 3 is the same as the previous 2 entries. You're still running around killing endless waves of demons, but some of the core mechanics were tweaked this time. As soon as the first cutscene ended, the first thing I noticed was that the movement felt so much better than before. It's a good thing these movements were better because the new styles mechanic definitely benefited from this. To no surprise, the game was broken up by missions, but before starting each one, you had the option to customize your loadout, which is where you would find these styles. Starting off, you had the option to choose between 4 of them, with a couple more being unlocked later. At first, I wasn't really feeling this because I thought it would force me to change the way I wanted to play, but once I tried out each one, it became apparent that these are meant to be swapped and changed frequently depending on the situation. If you were to ask me what was the best style to use, it would be the Trickster easily. To put it simply, this action move lets you dash or sort of quick step so you can evade enemy attacks. It may not seem like a big deal, but when you have to press multiple buttons just to roll, it comes in clutch. What makes these actions even better is that they automatically upgrade over time just by using them. I thought this was a good addition because I've always been a fan of in-game upgrades, but what makes these so great is that they're actually helpful. For example, once the Trickster action is upgraded, you can then dash 3 times in a row before stopping. Triggering can be done with a push of one button, making it extremely easy to execute. It was Trickster for me, but once you discover which action best suits your playstyle, you'll find the one that you like the main for most of the missions. Take it a step further and understand what each style does, and you'll know how to adjust your style based on that particular fight. These actions seem like a useless mechanic on the surface, but once you take the time to learn them, they prove very useful during every combat scenario. As much as I love the improved movement, one thing I absolutely hated was the fact that you had to pay for double jump. In the past 2 games, you started out with that ability right from the start, but for some reason, this wasn't the case in 3. I know what you're thinking, okay, this guy's making this a bigger deal than it really is. Just save up the red orbs and buy the ability. And you would be right. I did have to buy the skill eventually, but it should have been available from the start. And to make matters worse, you can't use the ability when you have any weapon equipped. It's weapon specific. I didn't even buy the ability until the very end of the game, so I ended up jumping off of walls and landing on obstacles to grab the orbs and reach high ledges. This brings me to another point that has been a thorn in this franchise's side: the camera. I'm happy to say that the camera is a lot better than the past 2 games, and it made a big difference. For starters, I loved how you could move the camera just by rotating the analog stick, which is a basic function, but I don't think you could do this in the previous games. When moving from place to place, the camera still does that thing where it switches angles after you travel a certain distance, but it's not as jarring as it was before. The enemies weren't placed too high where you couldn't reach them, and even if they were on top of ledges, you could manually move the camera to put them into view. Similar to DMC1, there's plenty of rooms where you're surrounded by enemies and don't have a lot of space to move. Being able to move the camera helped me tremendously as I could always view where each enemy was coming from. Targeting enemies benefited from the camera as well, with it being easy to lock on to each demon even when they're placed at different angles than the other demons in the area. The entire camera system made the gameplay flow nicely, since it was pretty difficult. Unlike the first game, nobody told me that DMC3 is very difficult. I played the game on normal and was getting my ass kicked on several occasions. It's nowhere near the hardest game I've ever played, but unless you play on easy, you can't rush your way through the game and expect to complete a playthrough. You have to learn each fight, understand the enemies, and configure your loadout to make it optimal for every situation. I knew right from the start that this game was going to take a lot of focus. I believe what makes this game so hard is that it felt as if the enemies got stronger and you stayed the same as you progressed throughout the game. Don't get me wrong, I know that you can collect items and upgrade weapons or actions, but even still, it felt as if every enemy had a high damage output while you remained the same. Even regular enemies like these annoying ass spiders were killing me, let alone the boss fights. Speaking of bosses, they were all challenging for different reasons.
It's the stench of betrayal, the odor of that accursed Sparta. I will annihilate every last blood relation of Sparta!
A son cleaning up his dad's mess, huh? Where have I heard this story before?
Each boss was diverse in not only look, but in attacks as well. What I liked about these was how the demons were all unique, making them distinct from one another. No matter which boss it was, they all had attacks that required you to change your loadout. I'd be lying if I said I didn't die a lot in these fights, because I died over and over and over. I thought that the saving grace was that the patterns for each fight were predictable, and if you paid attention, they would repeat them in quick succession. Even with that information, they still proved hard to stop. But I'll give you an example of a fight that appears to be very difficult, but can be finished easily just by swapping your style. The Demon Brothers fight.
In case you didn't get the hint, I'll spell it out. You're a guest. Wants to go through. Got it?
Our job here is to guard this pool. That's right, we can't let you pass.
This early game fight is tough as you have to fight two demons wielding swords and you have to go against them at the same time. To make it even harder, once you defeat one, the other uses the dead brother's soul and turns Super Saiyan Demon or something. So what can you do? Go into the menu, change your style to Sword Master, and then counterattack the brothers when they use their swords. Doing this causes them to stagger, and then you can go ham and kill them with ease, before one of them gets the chance to transform. This is only one example, but if you truly learn the mechanics, even the hardest boss fights can be beaten easily. In every DMC game, you get an array of weapons to choose from. And this third title continues that trend. Most of them were present in the past two games, with you having a pistol, shotgun, sniper, and a couple others. What surprised me the most was that the shotgun wasn't as good as it was before. When I first unlocked the shotgun, I started using that immediately, but realized it wasn't as effective. So for this game, I leaned on Ebony and Ivory, the pistols, and upgraded those to the max, which proved to be a great decision. Many of the enemies can be shredded with the pistols, so I highly advise you to use those and upgrade them when you have the chance. In regards to the melee weapons, I can say that every single weapon has a purpose and are particularly useful in the boss fights. I liked how you get to equip two weapons at a time and you can switch between them almost seamlessly just by pressing R2. Each of these has unique benefits, and when combined with different styles, you can create unique combos and attacks that serve you well in the combat. If I had to choose a favorite, it would be the sword, as it's tried and trusted, but its skills are nice when upgraded too. Choosing what skills to upgrade for each weapon depends on how you like to play, but be sure to grab the air hike from one of the weapons that offers it, because you're going to need it. Maybe this is how DMC games are made, but I thought the overall loop of the gameplay was a bit repetitive. Obviously this game is about killing a bunch of demons, so some repetitiveness is to be expected, but in this title it was a little different. While in each level you're solving puzzles and fighting various face enemies, usually you have to collect orbs or fragments to then insert into a statue to progress. This is fine for a couple missions, but later on, it gets old really fast. In almost every level, you have to find or grab some sort of magical orb to then insert into something else to unlock another item. Once you reach the end game, you'll realize how much you actually do this. This isn't enough for you to drop the game, but you may find yourself saying, damn, I gotta find another orb? Alright, let's get this over with. I played the special edition of the game, which lets you play as Virgil, but after completing the story, I was ready to be done and move on, so my time with Virgil was brief. But in that brief amount of time, playing with Virgil was pretty fun. His sword attacks are fast and sharp, with it being easy to kill multiple demons with just one slash. Movement wise, it's just as good as Dante, so performing actions with different styles felt great as well. Maybe if there was additional story or new cutscenes I would play if you did a run as Virgil, I would have ran it back, but after finishing the main game with Dante once, I was good. The gameplay for Devil May Cry 3 is so much better than it was in 2, and fixes a lot of the issues I had with that game. Even if the game is really hard, learning the mechanics and defeating the bosses is rewarding and puts your gaming skills to the test. The story for this game feels like an actual sequel to the first, and not just a side story. You open the game with Dante accepting an invitation from his brother Virgil, and then going on a journey to get to said invitation. What happens in between is not what you expect, as you see the story unravel slowly as you complete each mission. When it comes to DMC, I would say don't expect a complex plot because they're really easy to understand. At least in these 3 games. The stakes are made known up front, and the twist that happens late game is one that you may not see coming. To me, the most important aspect of the story is that it had that DMC feel to it. Coming off the last game, right from the first mission, everything felt exactly as it should. The dialogue was serious, but had plenty of corny and funny lines to give it that DMC sort of stamp. There isn't a lot of characters, which makes it easy to focus on the small cast and what their goals or motivations are. Believe it or not, there is some emotion conveyed throughout this story as you see Dante and Virgil battle not only each other, but what they believe in. The struggle between brothers and the impact that their father had on this universe makes everything feel connected and meshes really well together. On the other hand, a new character called Lady, who you'll see early on, has her own motivations, and once you understand why she acts the way she does, it makes it easier to show empathy towards her character. One thing I was surprised on was that there was no Trish. Again, I'm not trying to come off as a Trish lover, but she was a good character and I'd love to see her back in the main story. Not as a playable character, but actually in the main story. Nonetheless, this story is better than you would expect, even if the plot isn't that deep. You gain a deeper insight on Virgil and are able to see the relationship between him and Dante grow as the story continues. Sprinkle in a couple new characters and you have a semi-predictable yet easy to understand story that fits perfectly in this universe. Lastly, I wanted to mention that this game feels like it went back to formula. Playing through this is what made me enjoy the first game so much to begin with. Even from the beginning, I recognized the pop and flair that usually comes with DMC, and it made all the difference. The environments weren't super bright and colorful, but they included those mind-bending, time-altering locations that added another layer to the overall atmosphere. The corny jokes and fast-paced action aligned with what DMC is at its core. Each cutscene portrayed the characters well and had you actually care about them along with the decisions that they make. Before in DMC 2, they introduced characters that seemed like they didn't fit within the DMC universe. Lucia was cool, but outside of her, there wasn't anybody worth noting. Just the fact of you starting the game out inside Dante's shop made it more immersive and had it feeling more in line with the first. Add in the music and unique weapons, and this game is everything that DMC 2 wasn't. Before, I didn't understand why so many people would say, skip DMC 2 man, you don't need to play it. But now, I get it. Putting it simply, it feels like DMC 3 is the sequel that DMC 2 isn't. This game is everything that you would expect to see, and if you played the first game, it feels like you're right at home. Overall, Devil May Cry 3 is a hard but rewarding experience that's a joy to play through. The core mechanics have been improved, and even with some small questionable changes, this game is definitely worth a playthrough. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8. The challenge this game presents makes it attractive to those who want to test their gaming skills, but if you master the mechanics, you may find yourself coming back and replaying this multiple times. I didn't rate this much higher than DMC 2, but the difference between the games are night and day. If you're on the fence about playing this game, I would say get it on sale and give it a try. It's definitely worth it. Should you play Devil May Cry 4 in 2024? Well, coming off of Devil May Cry 3, which many deem as the hardest game in the series, I was excited to move on to the next game in the franchise. Going into this, I had zero expectations, but considering this was the first DMC game to be on PlayStation 3, I was definitely intrigued. Releasing 16 years ago in 2008, this was a game that I missed out on during that generation that I hear is pretty good. Nonetheless, let's break this game down and see if it's worth at least one playthrough.
You got a jacked up notion of fair play, pal. And it's beginning to piss me off.
Fundamentally, DMC4 has the same gameplay as the past games, with you playing from a third-person perspective in a variety of areas killing a bunch of creatures. Where this game differs is in its structure, as you can play as both Nero and Dante. Before starting the game, you can check the menu and see that the main story has 2 playable characters, making it known up front who's available to use. If you play DMC2, then you might think it's similar to this, but it's really not, which I think is a good thing. In that game, there were 2 main characters, Dante and Lucia, but in order to get a full understanding of the story, you had to complete a full playthrough with both. However, in this game, you play as Nero for about half the story and then switch over to Dante for the second half. I thought this was a great way to keep the gameplay engaging because each of them plays different, and by the time you reach Dante's section, it feels like home. Movement wise, both players feel the same, but when playing as Nero, he has a devil arm that can grab enemies from reasonable distances. Honestly, this move is OP, and you can snatch pretty much anything once you upgrade the ability enough. Press the grab button twice and you'll be throwing or smashing demons with ease. On the other hand, Dante plays just as he has the entire series, but the small changes in this title make all the difference. Most notably, the ability to switch styles is a mechanic that should have been in the game sooner, but was finally implemented in this title. Previously, you had to go into the menu before the start of each mission and choose a style that you wanted, with the game forcing you to keep that style until you reach a divinity statue where you could change it. Being able to switch styles in the middle of combat gives you the ability to adapt on the fly and to adjust to the different attacks that the enemies throw at you. Just like Nero, you have the option to purchase abilities and unlock new moves for your weapons or styles. Find a way to implement these into the combat and your version of Dante will be lethal to say the least. Shout out to Link Sergio Belmont, who commented on my DMC3 review, letting me know that in the Nintendo Switch version of that game, there's a freestyle mode that allows you to switch styles, devil arms, and firearms all on the fly. Even though it was included in the Switch version, it wasn't in the original DMC3, so I'm glad that you could do all of that in DMC4. Sometimes the smallest gameplay tweaks can make all the difference. What makes this combat better than the previous games is that memorizing the different moves with each character led to devastating combos that actually made a difference during each fight. Of course, you've always had the ability to combine different moves to create a combo, but this game takes it up a notch. Understanding which moves to perform and when to perform them can be the reason why you live or the reason why you die. You can mash the attack button constantly, but eventually that's not going to work, as the enemies get harder and defend a lot more than you might expect. To put it simply, if you combine your basic attacks with the guns and air launchers, the combos you create are going to be insane. One thing I didn't like about this game was the way some of the missions were structured. There's multiple times where you have to solve a puzzle to get across an area, and if you fail, you drop down all the way to a place where you're forced to kill a handful of enemies. Normally this isn't a big deal, but if you fail multiple times, you have to fight the demons over and over again, which I thought was completely unnecessary. The devs could have just made us fall down and then climb back up, but that's just me. Also, some of the puzzles could have been better or just scrapped altogether. A great example is later on in the game you have to roll a dice to get across a room. I won't explain how it works, but why would anybody think this is fun? I admire the creativity, but let's just keep it like all the other rooms and have us kill enemies in order to progress. It's one of those situations where some ideas look better on paper than when they're actually made a reality. Either way, it's not a deal breaker, just a slight annoyance. Now, I played the special edition of the game on PS5, which gives you a whole bunch of orbs and additional costumes, which I thought was pretty cool. So when I used Dante and Nero, I chose to wear the alternate costumes, and to my surprise, I had unlimited Devil Trigger when wearing them. I had absolutely no idea that this was even possible. I thought it was purely cosmetic, but if you end up playing the special edition of the game yourself, be sure to equip one of the other costumes so you can have this benefit for your playthrough. Regarding the difficulty, I played on normal and it wasn't nearly as hard as 3 was. Even without the bonus orbs and proud souls, it still would have been pretty easy. The enemies don't deal too much damage and the checkpoints during each mission are pretty forgiving, on the off chance that you do end up struggling in a certain section. Something worth mentioning is that the fights aren't in very small areas like the previous games either. You still travel from place to place with the entryways being blocked off sometimes, but each room always has enough space to operate. Jumping, executing attacks, and dodging can all be done with room to spare, keeping the flow of the combat at a nice pace. Unless they change with an increase in difficulty, the enemies don't get in your way as you're performing the movements either, as they go through their own attack pattern, but it's not directly in front of your face. I don't know about you, but there was no way I was playing any of those super hard difficulties that would make this game infuriating. There's a whole bunch of options to choose from too, so if you do want to challenge yourself, the devs give you that choice. I mentioned a bit ago that I played the special edition of the game, but what I didn't tell you was that Virgil, Trish, and Lady are all playable characters in that version. Personally, I didn't play with them much, but I did try them out briefly, and they're pretty fun to use. I liked how they weren't just skins, but they actually played how they should, with unique moves and abilities between them. For example, when using Lady, you can spam her rocket launcher, which is a slow yet powerful attack. Just this attack alone gives her a unique feel compared to the rest of the characters. What I thought didn't matter as much as before was the guns. When playing with Dante, there wasn't one that I gravitated to more than the others, but instead it was more of what was best for the situation. It didn't matter if you used the pistols, shotguns, or something else, which weapon you chose was on a case-by-case basis. Once you get far enough into the game, you'll understand which situation fits each weapon, and then you can implement that into the overall gameplay. Side note, you can alternate between guns and swords by pressing L2 and R2, making it easy to switch weapons in real time. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the boss fights. In my opinion, the boss fights in this game are the best in the franchise up to this point. The combination of variety, locations, and attacks make each one memorable for their own reasons. You probably already guessed this, but yes, you fight most of the same bosses as both Nero and Dante, making each encounter feel the same, but different. Again, the fights are in large arena type locations and give you plenty of room to download the boss until you're ready to strike. Using the deadly combos on these bosses is very satisfying, as you can stun them and then just go ham. On a harder difficulty, you're going to have to be more careful, as if you don't pay attention, you might die pretty fast. Just be sure to stock up on vital stars and holy waters, and you'll be good. Overall, the gameplay for DMC4 is the best in the franchise for its time, and is the main reason why anybody would want to return for multiple playthroughs. If you played the story for any other DMC game, then you know that these are fun, playful, and not to be taken too seriously, and this title continues that trend. Set in the fictional city of Fortuna, you follow Nero and Dante as they attempt to stop a priest with demonic powers. What shocked me the most about this plot was the amount of cutscenes that were used to tell the story. Just like before, the story is spread out between the missions, but this game gives you plenty of scenes that explain the plot. You know right from the beginning that this is the first in the franchise to have more scenes, as the prologue is a lot longer than you would expect. I actually found myself sitting there like, holy crap, this is still the intro? Don't get me wrong, I loved how many cutscenes were in the game because it helped me understand exactly what was going on and why it was happening. Without the additional context, some of the moments may have felt out of place. One critique that I've always had in DMC games is the lack of characters. Starting from the first game, the cast has always been small, but the inclusion of all the characters was never there. It felt as if they were all segmented instead of being present in the same place. Thankfully, this game fixes that as all the characters involved interact with each other at different moments, creating a feel of connectivity that wasn't present before. In regards to the setting, the city wasn't anything new, but it makes sense considering who the main villain was. For the first time, this game actually had NPCs that were included in the story. Throughout this entire series, there was nobody else except our heroes and the villains. It felt as if everything that takes place is sectioned off from the rest of the world, even though the dialogue makes it known that the world will have consequences if they don't save the day. The game still had some of the trippy, mind-bending stuff you would expect to see in DMC, but it was toned down a little bit as a lot of the game takes place within or nearby areas surrounding the city. Speaking of nearby areas, I thought the plot did a good job at making the switch in location feel natural. Too many times in games we go to another place just because it's the next level. This game has everything fit inside that specific area, having it all make sense. The bosses, characters, and story bits all take place within those places, never bringing up the question if it was worth coming here in the first place. I mentioned earlier about Virgil, Lady, and Trish being playable, but what I didn't say is that they have different opening and ending cutscenes compared to Nero and Dante. In my opinion, it's not enough to warrant 2 extra playthroughs just to see those cutscenes, but if you really like this game, go ahead. If you want to see what's in those moments, just watch them online. It'll save you a lot of time. The story for DMC4 is in line with the previous games, but does a better job at including more characters and slowly implementing them into the plot. In regards to the story, this game does a solid job at keeping you entertained just enough while staying true to what DMC is at its core. So should you play Devil May Cry 4 in 2024? That answer would be a definite yes. Overall, the game is just fun to play. The quality of life changes from the previous games all make a huge difference in the gameplay, and the story is explained better than it ever has been. The additional cutscenes make going through each level worth it and align with the other games that released during that generation. If I had to give it a rating, I would say this game is a solid 8.5. This game is better than the previous 3 games, and if you play the special edition, you get additional content that may entice you to run through this title multiple times. If you're on the fence about getting this, don't be, because if you like fast-paced hack and slash games, this is right up your alley. Should you play Devil May Cry 5 in 2024? Well, coming off of Devil May Cry 4 that released all the way back in 2008, this 5th entry in the series would finally release 11 years later on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. Having recently gone through the past 4 DMC games myself, I was excited to see what the 5th game had in store. Even though this released only 5 years ago, I never got around to playing this on the last gen consoles, so I completely missed all the hype that was around the game when it first dropped. Nonetheless, let's talk about what makes Devil May Cry so good: the gameplay.
You taking notes? All right, time to kick some ass.
With DMC5 being the first main game in the franchise in a long time, I came in with the expectation of the game being improved upon from the 4th. If you play DMC4, you already know how big the leap was from 3 to that game, and in my opinion, the same thing happened from 4 to 5. Putting it simply, this title feels like the culmination of everything that was built upon from the first game. Like every mechanic that was present since DMC1 was implemented in the best way possible for this 5th title. A big issue I was hoping would be fixed in this was the camera. If you played the older games, then you know how much of a pain in the ass the camera was. From changing angles at the worst times to not revealing aerial enemies, in each title, the camera had issues. However, I feel like now it's finally been improved to the best it could possibly be. It's still not perfect, but that's not because of the mechanics surrounding the camera, but more with the environment. Many times when you're fighting enemies, you'll be in a variety of areas. Sometimes there'll be large open spaces, tight corridors, or small rooms. Regardless, you'll find yourself moving all over the place. Where the problem lies is when you line up your character or the enemy in front of certain pieces within the environment. When this happens, the camera moves to keep your character in view, as it should, but the debris or object in the area line up with the camera as well. It could be a wall, building, or something else, but the obstacle will completely fill up the camera and prevent you from seeing what's going on until you moved. This isn't a big deal when playing on normal like I did, but I can imagine if you're playing on one of the harder modes, then not being able to see could be the difference between life and death. Either way, if this is the biggest issue with the camera, I'll take it, because the overall camera system used to be a hell of a lot worse. When it comes to Devil May Cry, the combat is the heart and soul of the franchise. No matter which game you play, the hack and slash action combat is the reason why these games have the popularity they do. If you didn't already know, you play as 3 characters over the course of the story: Nero, Dante, and V. Again, if you play DMC 2 or 4, then you're already familiar with using various characters and how all of that is implemented into the gameplay. What I thought Capcom did a great job of was making the gameplay for each character actually feel different from each other. Every time I switched characters, I had to adjust my approach to the combat because some characters could do things that others couldn't. Since I like playing as each character, I wanted to highlight some of the things I felt were worth mentioning for each of their gameplay. As expected, you play as Nero, and his gameplay is very similar to what it was in DMC4. To me, what makes Nero so special is that his Devil Breaker is so useful, and it's evident that Capcom thought the same thing. Before, you could only grab enemies with it, which I still love doing, but now Nero could attach different arms with various abilities that would completely change how you approach every combat scenario. Some arms were more melee focused while others could slow down time. Add in the Red Queen and Blue Rose, and Nero has a plethora of attacks at his disposal. What makes the Devil Breaker better is that it feels natural to use in tandem with the sword and the gun. So if you like physical attacks, combine combos using the Red Queen and the Devil Breaker. For range attacks, just use the Blue Rose instead. It all works well and makes it easy to adjust when facing different enemies. When you play as Dante, it feels like you're right at home. Maybe because he's the main character of the entire series, but I could have skipped the tutorials and I would have known exactly what to do in regards to his combat. Just like DMC4, you have access to the different styles and you could switch between them at any second, which makes the number of different combos seem infinite. Again, you could use the weapons like the pistols, shotguns, or rocket launchers, but if you played the older games, you probably could have guessed that. They feel about the same, but it's worth noting that you can use charge shots, which would do some added damage. You get some new melee weapons, but it's the differences between them that makes them so unique. Of course you have the sword, nunchucks, and others, but they differ so greatly that it's easy to discern when and when not to use them. But what makes Dante so much fun to use is that he gets his upgraded demon form later in the game that makes him OP, at least on normal. Unlike the normal Devil Trigger, he doesn't regain health, but the damage in this new form is insane. The best way to describe it is like going from Super Saiyan 1 all the way to Super Saiyan 3. It takes a bit of time to get enough bars to activate it, but once you do, you'll shred almost anything that's in your path. Finally, we get to the newest addition in the game, V. When I first started up the game, I was like, who the hell is this? And I really didn't care about using him. But once I actually understood his combat, I liked it a lot. Instead of constantly being the aggressor in all the encounters, V's combat is a lot more passive aggressive, and it took a bit of adjusting to get used to. You have access to these two demonic creatures, which was pretty much a bird and a panther. These two are the main things that would be attacking the enemies instead of V. You give each of the creatures commands, and depending on the button combination inputted, they would perform a certain move. Afterwards, you can use V to finish off the enemies once they're stunned. This means that you're not actually fighting anything, you're just commanding other demons to fight for you. Personally, I enjoyed this type of gameplay a lot, even if I was a bit skeptical at first. But I completely understand if you didn't care for his gameplay because it's drastically different from what we're used to in a DMC game. A big reason I liked using him was because the giant demon that appears when using his Devil Trigger does massive damage and stays for a lot longer than you think. To make it even better, you're able to manually fill the Devil Trigger bars just by holding a button. In my opinion, if you can make the mental switch from attack, attack, attack to more of a defensive slash or evade mindset, you may enjoy V's gameplay. Now you may be wondering, okay, you just went through all of those characters and mentioned a lot of abilities, but can you upgrade any of those? And that would be a great question. Before, in order to upgrade anything, you have to access a divinity statue and use your red orbs to acquire the upgrade. But now they made it a lot more cinematic as a new character drives up and gives you access to a sort of workshop where you can purchase everything you need. This not only includes abilities, but items and weapons, all which could be slotted into different sets that could be equipped depending on the mission. Even though it's nothing new, being able to buy upgrades in the middle of the mission comes in clutch, especially after losing a lot of items or health during the fights. Speaking of health, this brings me to the one aspect of the gameplay that was changed that I couldn't get over, and that was the healing system. I could be mistaken, but I believe in every one of the main DMC games you had to use green vital stars to heal yourself when running low on health. These could be found all over the place within each mission or be bought via divinity statues. What had me confused in this game was that sometimes the health was inside green crystals or the crystals themselves were spread across an entire area. I didn't want the game to baby me, but going through each level, it seemed like there wasn't a whole lot of health pickups to find. Of course, some of them are right in front of your face, so they were hard to miss, but other times I found myself thinking, damn, where can I find some health at? To make matters worse, they removed the ability to purchase vital stars from statues in the workshop, but instead offer permanent health upgrades instead. You can still buy gold stars for revivals, but not having vital stars for sale just messed with my brain. It's like I couldn't wrap my head around it. It didn't make any sense. I think to offset this, the devs decided to allow you to use the red orbs to revive yourself, but I didn't think it was the same. I thought that when playing as Nero, you really felt the impact of this. Unlike Dante or V, you couldn't use the Devil Trigger and regain your health, so if you missed the health pickups, were low on orbs, or ran out of gold stars, you were in for a tough time. Unless there was a Devil Bringer arm that regained some of your health, you didn't have many options when using them. Maybe to others this isn't a big deal, but for some reason I never fully adjusted to this change during my entire playthrough. Another thing I thought was done really well was the boss fights. These have always been fun in the past games, but this game takes things to a whole nother level. All of these demonic creatures are different and pose various challenges compared to their counterparts. Mixing the fact you have to play as 3 characters, and the game does craft a solid challenge in regards to its bosses. If you played the older games, then you know that these fights didn't always take place in large, open areas. Many times you were in cramped rooms having to fight a boss that was complete BS, but now each fight is inside what feels like a small arena, giving you plenty of room to perform almost any action. I thought the fights themselves were all pretty good, but sometimes the attacks they performed felt a little cheap. Like there's a time where you're fighting a giant chicken and one of its attacks is to just start flailing all over the place. The easy answer is to dodge, but with the camera going up and down constantly, it's actually hard to execute. This is just one example, but sometimes the attacks of the enemies can be a bit frustrating, but this can be remedied by just getting good. Lastly, I wanted to mention that Virgil is playable, but only in the special edition of the game. To me, his gameplay is the best out of all the characters, and it's not even close. He's fast and is able to deal lots of damage from both up close and far away. There's some other differences in his entire gameplay experience, but overall, he's just fun to play as. I'd say if you're going to buy this game, be sure to get the special edition so you can run through some levels with him, because it's definitely worth it. The gameplay for DMC5 feels like the highest evolution of what has been established in the series thus far. Just about everything from before feels more fleshed out and smoother, which made the actual experience so much better. When it comes to the story, DMC continues that trend of having a simple and easy to understand plot. What I thought it did a good job of was establishing the power of the villain right from the start. The plot constantly jumps around between dates with times, with the game splicing itself together until you catch up to real time. I didn't mind this sort of storytelling because it's been done before. It was just crazy to see DMC have so many cutscenes and dialogue because it wasn't always like this. In the older games, there was no dialogue during the actual gameplay, as it always ended after each cutscene. Furthermore, the character interactions in 5 are diverse and continuously mix everyone together, which was great to see. All of the moments between each of them was worth watching, not because it had emotional impact, but because it was just cool to see Nero interact with Lady, or another pair speaking that normally doesn't come in contact with each other. Unfortunately, what I didn't like was what the plot ended up becoming. At first, it's about trying to kill an all-powerful demon that appears to be virtually unstoppable, but then it turns into something more predictable. What that is, I won't tell you, but what I will say is that by the time I hit the late game, the plot kinda felt like DMC 3.5. Even still, I thought the game did a solid job at leaving the door open to continue this game's story or open it up to a new cast of characters entirely. Personally, I would love to see a continuation with something not as predictable or a story that we haven't seen before. I don't expect too much since the stories for these games are never really fleshed out, but I feel like it's time this franchise takes a step in that direction, especially since it takes forever for these games to release. The last thing I wanted to mention was how good the game looked. With it releasing in the 8th console generation, this game featured beautiful graphics, especially compared to the older titles. The first thing I noticed was the character models. All of them looked realistic and almost lifelike, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact it was using the RE engine, which was the same as those Resident Evil remakes that have been releasing over the past couple years. I'm glad Capcom decided to use that engine because this title definitely benefited from it. Other than the characters, the enemies, environments, and effects all looked better than it ever has and had that typical flair that you would expect to see in a DMC game. Destroying crystals and smashing enemies all looked 3D and tangible, even though it wasn't. You may not have as much of an appreciation for the graphics if you didn't play the older titles, but when you look and compare how each of them look, the difference is staggering. Even using the HD collection as a reference, the upgrade in visuals is still night and day. Seeing Dante, Trish, and others finally look their best showed me what the devs always thought the characters should look like when the first game released all those years ago. Maybe I'm showing my age, but the older I get, the more I appreciate how good games look today because games used to look a lot worse. Regardless, this game is a treat to look at and the improved visuals added so much to the overall atmosphere. Overall, Devil May Cry 5 is an addicting experience that portrays the series at its best. Every facet of the game is improved from before, and it's apparent right from the opening cutscene. Outside of some small gameplay changes and a predictable story, there's not much in this game not to like. So that brings me to my question, should you play Devil May Cry 5 in 2024? That answer is yes. I think this is the best out of the main games and did a great job at improving what was established in DMC4 all those years ago. Hopefully it doesn't take another 11 years for the next DMC game to release, because DMC5 deserves a proper follow-up. If I had to give this game a score, I would give it an 8.5. There's so much to like about this game with very few flaws. It's definitely worth a playthrough. Should you play DMC Devil May Cry in 2024? This is a great question, because if you're someone like myself who didn't know that this game even existed, what reason do you have to play it? Back when this released in 2013, the last DMC game we had received was Devil May Cry 4, but Capcom decided to reboot the franchise and take it in a different direction. Thanks to this decision, this DMC game feels completely different from the others while still maintaining some traits that were first established in the previous games. But does this change in direction hurt the game, or does it make it better than the other DMC games that released before it? Let's discuss. When it comes to Devil May Cry, the combat is the main attraction. If you were to ask someone, why do you play DMC? More than likely, they'll tell you it's because the combat is so much fun. Thankfully, if there's one thing that Ninja Theory got right about this game, it's the combat, because the fighting in this title is amazing. At first, it doesn't seem like anything special, but once you get access to more weapons, it really begins to open up. What I thought this game did a great job of was adding in the different weapons over the course of the game, but still giving you enough time in between to actually test them out. For example, if you just got access to the Osiris, which is pretty much a scythe, the game has you kill enemies and created each level with the intention of using that weapon to finish the mission. This gives the player ample opportunity to try the weapon out and get used to how it works. Even more, you have the ability to try out the various combos on the enemies, helping you to figure out how to add them into your normal mix-ups. Over the course of the game, you'll receive 7 weapons, with each of them being accessible by pressing a directional button on your controller. Pressing this will swap one of these out for another, with the only thing being left to do is to actually input the button combination so you can use the weapon. Just like other DMC games, which weapon you like the best is completely dependent on your playstyle and how you like to play the game. Regardless of what weapon you choose to use during the combat, one feature that benefits all the players is the combo upgrade system. You could access this menu from the mission select screen or from Divinity statues, but within the upgrades tab you'll see each weapon you have unlocked, along with the moves you can perform for each of them. Some of these moves are grounded, with others being aerial, but the most important feature is the ability to test these moves out before purchasing. So for every move that you're thinking about purchasing, you have the option to test them out on an opponent and see how it feels to use before deciding to add the move to your arsenal. This doesn't seem like a big deal at first, but when you consider that the combat is at the core of the game, and you actually have to find the upgrades, this ends up being pretty meaningful. Speaking of the upgrades, I mentioned that you have to find them. Throughout each level, there's white orbs which now function as the upgrade orbs, which can be found by destroying these souls that are stuck inside walled surfaces. Most of these are right under your nose, but still out of plain view, as they can be easily missed if you don't check every nook and cranny of the surrounding area. Failing to seek these out and grab these upgrades can make the combat a little more challenging than it needs to be, since you're not utilizing the weapons to their full potential. In terms of how the combat feels, if you played any other DMC game, then you'll be right at home. It's fast and snappy, with it being really easy to perform long combos on virtually any enemy. What I think is stressed more in this title than the others is memorizing the abilities of the weapons and the weaknesses of the enemies. Most of the time during the levels, you're fighting similar enemies over and over, so once you understand what moves they're susceptible to, you can gain the advantage during the fights pretty fast. When you start the game, you can't do a whole lot because you don't have access to that many weapons, but once you have all the weapons at your disposal, it's just a matter of what kind of combos do you want to execute. Even with all the weapons and combos the game gives you, it still forces you to understand how each one works and when to use them. Why, you ask? It's because the enemies themselves can be divided up into 3 categories. Demons that can get killed by any weapon, demons immune to angel attacks, and angels immune to demon attacks. Each of these sound exactly as they are. If the demon can get killed by any weapon, then you can just slice and dice your way through them no problem. Simple stuff. But where it gets a bit trickier are the ones that are immune to angel or demon attacks. During combat, you'll notice that some demons glow red, sticking out of the crowd. When you see these enemies, you can only use your demon weapons against them. Trying to use the rebellion or the angel weapons won't work, as your attacks will just bounce right off them. On the flip side, the angels have a blue color and you have to use the angel weapons against those. But wait, it gets better. As you might have already guessed, the game then proceeds to throw in both demons and angels alongside regular enemies at any time during the combat. So this means that you need to understand what moves to use against what enemy to avoid getting hit by certain demons while you're trying to fight the others. This whole situation just reinforces the fact that you can't spam the attacks over and over because you can't beat the game doing it. It's literally impossible to do so. I thought it was pretty cool to make Dante half demon and half angel this time around, and have that be reflected in the combat was just icing on the cake. If you're able to master both the demon and angel weapons alongside the sword, then you'll become an absolute beast at this combat to say the least. One change that I wasn't the biggest fan of was the camera system. Devil May Cry 1 through 3 all had camera issues, with that being one of my biggest gripes with all 3 of those games. Although 4 seemed to have fixed the majority of those same issues. Even still, I was surprised that this reboot decided to move away from the hard lock system to more of a soft lock. To explain, normally you have a dedicated button that you would hit to lock onto enemies individually. In this game, that feature was removed and replaced with a soft lock, which would have Dante attacking whatever's in front of him or closest to him. Now, compared to the other game's camera systems, this wasn't nearly as bad, but I did find myself constantly hitting the R3 button to lock onto an enemy. Even when I finally realized I couldn't do that, there was times that I was attacking enemies that I didn't want to hit, just because it happened to be right next to me. I played the game on normal, but I can see this being a bigger issue if you're playing the game on a harder mode, because hitting the wrong enemy can leave you open and end up with you dying when you shouldn't have. The camera is easy to get used to, it's just one aspect that was changed that I didn't think needed to be. It's worth mentioning that in the definitive edition of the game, the feature of a manual lock-on function was added, and if I would have known that beforehand, I may have played that instead of the original. Regardless, the combat for Devil May Cry is the shining star of this game, and it's clear right from the opening mission. As I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of weapons that you have at your disposal, and they're broken up between angels and demons. But what I didn't say is that they each have 2 moves which you're going to be using a lot. The Rebellion, Dante's sword, transforms into a sort of grappling hook that changes abilities depending on if you're using angel or demon weapons. By pressing the right trigger and square, you can use your demon weapon to grab objects and pull them closer to you, giving you the ability to reach certain buildings or platforms. On the other hand, by pressing the left trigger and square, you can use the angel weapon to pull yourself to objects. These can be used in conjunction with the combat as well, but I would argue that their importance lies heavily in the traversal. Many times you're in a place where the buildings are falling apart or are being split into little bits, and you must use these sort of whips and chains depending on which color is attached to the building piece. At first it seems pretty simple, but the game slowly adds in more to make the traversal even more challenging. Not only do you have to time your jumps correctly, you have to know when to use the weapons as well. If you played any DMC game before, then you know of the air hike move, which lets you dash through mid-air, helping you to avoid enemies or reach ledges in the far distance. This was brought back, but implemented differently, as you could still air dash, but it would be through these green circles which would thrust you into the air upon activation. Building off of that, you would then have to zip to another ledge, all while maintaining the same height in the air. When describing it, it doesn't sound that hard, but when actually executing it, you have to be paying attention, as it's very easy to fall mid-jump. That brings me to the one thing that was removed that I wish wasn't, and that's the ability to run. Correct me if I'm wrong, but nowhere in the game does it give you an option to purchase something that allows Dante to perform a full-on sprint. Because of this, moving through place to place felt as if I was running through mud. Dante's sort of jog, if that's what you want to call it, is pretty slow. You go through a lot of linear areas and rooms, and having to jog through them slowed down the overall gameplay experience. There's times where you just get out of hectic combat scenarios where you're faced off against countless waves of enemies and are forced to make a quick getaway, only to have to jog your way out until you reach a grappling platform. In my opinion, this makes no sense, as in DMC4 all you had to do was hold the analog stick forward, and Nero or Dante would go from a light jog straight into a sprint. I thought of all the things in DMC that would be included, this would be it. To make things even worse, this means you couldn't run away from the enemies during combat either. You were forced to dodge or jump out of the way. Having the ability to sprint would have made this game even faster than it already was and take the traversal to a whole other level. Even still, the way the environments were all manipulated and contorted specifically for this traversal system was really cool. The entire mechanic of zipping across place to place seemed like it was inspired from God of War 3, which had released a couple years prior. In those games, Kratos was constantly using his weapons to pull himself or jump across to another area. It felt as if the devs took that mechanic and gave it their own DMC flair. Nonetheless, if there was a sprint button, this traversal might have been the perfect change up to what we normally receive in the DMC games. One thing I thought this game lacked a bit was the boss fights. Don't get it twisted, the boss fights that are present in the game are so fun and engaging, but I thought the quantity wasn't there. Comparing it to DMC4, which had more boss fights, this game had long gaps where I found myself wondering when the next fight was going to come. Again, going back to God of War, there's times where after getting an enemy to a certain level of health, an opening will appear somewhere on their body, prompting you to perform an action that will progress the fight. When these moments happened, I was expecting some sort of QTE to appear, but that never was the case. Even still, the small light that signifies the difference between angel and demon will be good enough for you to notice that you need to do something different outside of the normal combat. When you died, whether that be on a boss fight or during the mission leading up to it, you'll restart right from where you left off with full health. This caught me by surprise many times because in the old games, if you died during a mission, you had to start that mission over from the very beginning. A welcome change that made this game a lot easier to get through. If you're struggling against the bosses, you can use the gold orbs to revive yourself and keep the fight going. However, you can only hold 3 of these revives at once, so once you run out of them, it's up to you to get more. In my opinion, even on the hardest difficulty available on a first playthrough, you shouldn't need too many of these, because the bosses are pretty easy to beat. They run through a cycle of attacks that are predictable and easy to see. It's just a matter of timing your dodges correctly and making sure that you stay out of range. These boss fights do a solid job at capping off the missions. I just thought there should have been some more of them overall. In regards to the story, Devil May Cry changes things up while keeping some of the aspects the same. The plot takes place in Limbo City, which is a city controlled by powerful demons that are manipulating humanity. Unlike DMC 1, where Dante is a demon hunter and has his own shop, this version of Dante is younger and hunting demons isn't his main priority. One day a woman named Kat appears and warns him he's in danger, and the rest is history. As the plot is slowly revealed over the missions, Dante learns more about his origins and who he really is. Here's where you see the differences between this story and what we're used to in the original games. The biggest difference being that Dante is not half demon and half human, but rather half demon and half angel instead, with this game depicting Ava as an angel this time around. Virgil is in the game and looks similar to the original, but what's most important is that both Dante and Virgil's personalities are vastly different from the other titles. This is portrayed in the way they speak to each other and work together over the course of the story, because this was definitely not the case in the older games. What I liked about this plot was how the demons were able to take human form, which allowed us to see and interact with the demons that had the appearance of normal humans. So many times the demons that we see look like actual demons, like it's so obvious that they're demons you would have to be blind in order to not see it. I understand this was kind of the case in DMC4, but in this game, it felt more grounded and real. In DMC4, the characters seem more imaginary, but in this 2013 reboot, the demons actually felt human and demonic at the same time. Seeing them morph from human to demon was a sight to see, and was great at reminding you that yes, they all look like humans, but they're still in fact terrifying demons that had to be stopped. Unfortunately, the plot itself was kind of forgettable. I'm not sure if it was because of how the story was told or if the characters weren't memorable, but I didn't really start getting hooked into the story until the end. All the stuff that was happening during the earlier missions lacked impact and just felt like we were doing things, but none of them were vastly important, even though they actually were. To make things worse, this game repeated something at the very end that I absolutely did not want to see. Spoiler warning for those who haven't played, but having to fight Virgil again was insane. In total, you fight Virgil like 3 or 4 times throughout this entire series. Unless the whole theme of the series is centered around this feud between Dante and Virgil, I don't understand why this was even included in the game. Say what you want about DMC2, but one thing that I loved about the game is how you fight a villain that you never heard of, you kill him, and then the story ends. I was so content with killing the villain, and then the devs just throw in the Virgil twist, giving us a fight that was unnecessary. Yes, the fight was fun, as the majority of this game was, but seeing them work together all game long just for all that trust to be thrown out in an instant was disappointing to say the least. Even still, the places you go and events that take place leading up to the ending are memorable at times, but fail to make me care the way the older games did. I know it's the first game in this reboot, but what I think this game suffered from was the lack of a supporting cast, as I didn't like Kat and Virgil as much as Trish, Lady, and the original Virgil from the main series. If the supporting characters were better, maybe I would have enjoyed the story more. This plot isn't bad, I just think it could have been fleshed out more so we could get more emotionally attached to the characters outside of Dante. So this brings me back to the question, should you play DMC Devil May Cry in 2024? That answer is maybe. Overall, this game is good, but when you compare it to the other Devil May Cry games before it, it just feels out of place. The combat by itself is enough to justify the purchase, but when you add in a forgettable story and some questionable gameplay tweaks, it may not be worth purchasing at full price, especially considering the age of this game. If I had to give this game a rating, I would give it an 8, and that's mainly because of the combat. The combat in this game carries and is the only reason I would ever go back and play this. If it wasn't for that, I would have scored this lower. If you can find this game on sale, I would say give it a try. But if it's more than $15, wait for a steeper sale, because there's a chance you may not vibe with the series just because it's different than the other DMC games we've already gotten. I did enjoy my time with this game, but I'm glad Capcom decided to go back to the main universe and continue with that story, because those characters are just too memorable to let go.